certainly an issue that I think has certainly dominated state of New York, state government, the country, but particularly the last several months here in New York, which is the continued approach that our state, including Governor Hochul, the continued approach to managing, governing during this pandemic that our conference and many New Yorkers not only feel is wrong, but the data does not back up the policies. And I want to be clear, today we are not in the same space today that we were in the spring of 2020. In other words, we know more today. We know more about COVID. We're now into the third, if you would, iteration, the third strain. We have vaccines. The public is educated. And I would challenge anyone, if you look at the policies that New York State under Cuomo and Hochul have put forward, the mandates, the executive orders, I would dare anyone to show me a tangible metric difference between New York State and other states across the country. Deaths. We're doing as bad, if not worse, than most, if not all other states. Rates, hospitalizations, all those things. We have failed all the policies have failed to achieve at least the ends that we were told they would achieve. And it's gotten to the point where a lot of elected leaders no longer feel they even need to explain or justify these policies. That just doing them, it's anyone who challenges those, you must be a COVID denier. I want to be very clear. Our conference, Senator Ort, and the men and women behind me, no one is denying the reality and the significance of the pandemic we've lived through the last 2 years. There is a difference in disagreeing with policies and in looking at data and being practical about, is this working? That is a different and should be welcomed, as opposed to denying the existence of something. Our colleagues, many of them will force that false narrative. They will say, if you don't think mandates are right, well, that's because you're for recklessness, lawlessness, you're a COVID denier. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. And when you look at the policies, not only have they not stopped New York from the deaths we've had, the cases we've had, but I would argue they've actually exacerbated other problems that we now have that other states don't. Unemployment. Once upon this time, we lionized our healthcare workers. Lionized. We told everyone they were heroes, and we were right. But in a short span, some of those same workers, they have lost their jobs because they didn't get a vaccine or a booster. And let's be clear on that too. We told people, get a vaccine, get a booster. If you're in healthcare, you have to get it, or you'll be out of a job, or you won't be able to feed your family. We know for a fact, undeniably, that people who are vaccinated and boosted can still get COVID and still spread COVID. So why would we continue to force healthcare workers why would we not allow a test option? We have tests to stay in school. Why wouldn't we have a test to stay at your job? Especially when we need healthcare workers. If we're going to continue to battle the pandemic and the virus, we need people to do it. It isn't just going to happen. The National Guard isn't the final answer. Many of those National Guard members, by the way, guess what they do in their civilian jobs? They're nurses. They're in healthcare. So you're not actually adding anybody to the mix. You're just swapping uniforms. We have contributed to the healthcare worker shortage that was there before and is now worse because of the mandates, because of these policies. And I would argue it hasn't saved anybody. Those mandates haven't worked. And we could go through a list of data that would verify that. So what we're calling for is a transition from mandates to guidance. I, in this conference, trust New Yorkers, and I would argue that the governor and my colleagues across the aisle do not. If they did, they wouldn't have to rely on mandates. They would have you believe that absent the government, New Yorkers wouldn't know what to do. Absent the government, New Yorkers couldn't possibly be safe. Absent the mandates, it would be, we'd all, the death numbers would be a record highs. That's simply not true. New Yorkers know what to do. They know. They've been doing it themselves across various parts of the state for the entire pandemic. Business owners want to protect their customers. Nurses want to protect their patients. Parents want to protect their families. Teachers want to protect their students. It doesn't mean because it's coming from here. It's people. I trust New Yorkers at this point in the pandemic, 2 years in, to make the right decision. And we should continue to put out guidance, and New Yorkers will pay attention. We should continue to put out education and information, and New Yorkers will pay attention. But weaponizing the government to divide people in a way that has not helped stop the spread, but what it has done, we've got people advocating for permanent at-home schooling. Permanent. Nothing could be more harmful to the future of New York than forcing students to be permanently at home. Distance learning, from what I've seen, it just means kids are distanced from learning. And that is not an answer. We have demonized people, demonized communities around this notion, and the science simply doesn't back it up at this point. The data doesn't back it up. And whether it's education, childcare, healthcare, or just good old-fashioned common sense, we need to transition to a new phase in this pandemic. And I would remind everybody, we need to learn. We've been saying this for a long time. We need to learn to live. We're going to have to learn to live with COVID. I don't know that COVID is going anywhere tomorrow. I wish it would, but I don't know that it is. And living with COVID does not mean your child being at home for the rest of his education or her education. It does not mean forcing healthcare workers to get a vaccine that doesn't actually stop the spread or transmissibility of the virus. It may protect the nurse from ending up in the hospital, but it doesn't prevent her or him from transmitting the virus to a possible patient. So let's be smart. Let's look at the data. Let's move to guidance, focus on guidance. New Yorkers will listen. I trust New Yorkers. And it's time Governor Hochul and my colleagues across the aisle do the same. And at this time, I want to call up my colleague from Staten Island, someone who has been a strong voice against policies that haven't worked, whether it was Governor Cuomo, whether it was former Mayor Bill de Blasio, or Governor Hochul now, my colleague, our deputy leader, Senator Andrew Lanza.
Thank you, Senator Ortt. Once again, I just have to say how proud I am to be part of this Republican conference with Senator Ortt as our leader. He gets it. He always has. This conference gets it. He leads us in our fight for the people of the state of New York, regardless of the fact that we're standing opposed to the powers that be, that we're going against the status quo, in spite of the fact that it is sometimes and most often not politically correct. We don't care because we care about New Yorkers. You know, this pandemic has shown us a lot. It's exposed, one of my favorite movies, Clint Eastwood, it's exposed the good, the bad, and the ugly, and too much of it has been bad. And one of the things that we've learned is that the bureaucracy that is in place to protect and to educate our students across the state of New York does not know what it's doing. It is clear that what has been exposed by this pandemic is the incompetence of the bureaucracies here in New York. If you want to understand the epic fail that New York's management of the COVID pandemic has been, look no further than what New York mandates have done to our students. You know, my father turned 87 years old yesterday. I had a long conversation with him. He lived through the aftermath of the Depression and World War II. And he was a child, a student in grammar school in New York City during World War II. And he said something very interesting to me. He said through all that, there were no disruptions. there didn't seem to be the same kind of chaos in the schools that he's watching and he's looking in terms of his grandchildren and on the in the news. And that is just a sad reflection in terms of what has happened here in New York. I can report to you, I witnessed firsthand what happened in New York City. The former chancellor there, Carranza, who to me is best known for his discriminatory policies against Asian American students. You know, the left constantly talks about the next catastrophe coming around the corner. They will have you believe that next week and every week the world is going to end. So at least you would think they would be prepared for it. When he turned off our schools and sent our kids home, there was not a single plan in place. They didn't have a mask, they didn't have sanitizers, they didn't have tablets, they didn't have a remote learning plan. They had nothing for our children. Zero. That's the bureaucracy. The state education department offered nothing to our parents, to our teachers, to our administrators, to our students. If not for the teachers on Staten Island and across this state, and the administrators, the principals and the APs, and the parents who stepped up, our children would have lost even more than they lost. What did they lose? So, baseball seasons were canceled. Basketball seasons were canceled. Proms were canceled. Drama clubs were canceled. You can go on and on, lacrosse. And you might think, well, that's all trivial, big deal sports. Well, it isn't if you're a junior in high school or a senior in high school. It's very important in your life. And then look at the education that they missed out on. Every study is now showing that our students in New York, educationally, are behind. Why? Why? Because as the leader said, mandates that didn't work. It would be one thing. We heard they were going to flatten the curve. All they did was flatten our economy and flatten our kids. It would be one thing if you shut down the economy, you closed schools, you fired teachers, you fired healthcare workers, you fired employees, you put restaurants out of business. It would be one thing if you looked after all of that and you said, but we saved lives. Look what good it did. They did all that. And they didn't save a single life. As Leader Ort said, when you look at New York's numbers, after all those mandates, after all those shutdowns, after all those students sent home, we have one of the highest death rates on planet Earth. As Senator Ort said, in terms of the mandates today, you know, I had a laugh. I was actually home. I listened at the beginning of the Omicron variant. The governor and people from the health department mentioned that it had hit New York. Ground zero for Omicron seemed to be some event, a convention in New York City, where everyone was required to be vaccinated to be there. And that was the first sort of super spreader event. I'm not blaming anybody there. You blame Omicron. But that's where it all spread. That seems to be the source in New York. If it wasn't there, it would have been somewhere else. The point is, everyone there was vaccinated. And I remember she read the statistics. I think she said something like there were 87 new cases, or the first cases. We have 87 here in New York. 85 were vaccinated, 2 weren't. So I urge you to get vaccinated. And by the way, I'm considering vaccine mandates for students in September of 2022. I mean, if it were a Saturday Night Live skit, I would think it would be a bit too much.